Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. So Dr. Brant Cartwright is the author of 3 books, a professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, maintains a private practice in San Francisco, focusing on integral and neuroscience-informed approach to brain health. And in his spare time, he speaks and gives workshops. So Dr. CORTRIGHT specialises in depression, stress and anxiety, as well as relationships and intimacy issues. Today, we'll chat to him about his latest book, The Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle, Upgrade Your Brain, Upgrade Your Life. So firstly, Dr. CORTRIGHT, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm quite excited to talk to you about the brain and brain health. But firstly, can you just give us a bit of a rundown for those that haven't read the book? What is neurogenesis and why is it so revolutionary?
Okay, good. So neurogenesis is the process of making new brain cells. It's the genesis of new neurons. And it used to be believed up until the late 1990s, less than 20 years ago, that the brain stopped growing new brain cells once we were in our early 20s. And after that, it was just one slow, gradual die-off. But then they discovered that actually, no, the brain makes new brain cells throughout our entire lifetime. Now, for a long time, they didn't then know the significance of this. But in the last few years, it's become clear that our rate of neurogenesis is hugely important. So it turns out that a low rate of neurogenesis, that is, a low rate at which your brain is making new brain cells, is associated with anxiety, with stress, with depression, and with cognitive deficits, memory problems, cognitive decline. And a high rate of neurogenesis, that is a high rate at which your brain is making new brain cells, is associated with the opposite, with robust emotional resilience and protection against stress, anxiety, depression, and cognitive enhancement, rapid learning, rapid problem solving. And that most people can increase their rate of neurogenesis by 5 times. And that's what this book is about, how to increase your rate of neurogenesis. It's a holistic approach, body, heart, mind, spirit, a holistic approach to brain health and increasing your rate of neurogenesis.
Wow, so you mentioned 5 times. Firstly, how do you measure that? And secondly, does it depend on your age?
It doesn't depend on your age unless we're talking about extreme old age. In extreme old age, it seems like it can increase 3 to 5 times. Everyone else seems like 5 times. And there's many ways of measuring it. The most definitive is it can't be done on humans. It has to be done on monkeys and other animals because it involves slicing the brain and looking at it under a microscope. But there's other indicators that are pretty good, like functional MRI, various forms of neuroimaging, glucose uptake, blood flow, things like that.
Okay, so if the, say, average listener wanted to obviously get 5 times their brain health, how would they go about that?
Okay, good. So again, this is a holistic approach because all parts of us we experience through the brain. Most people don't think about this very often, but we experience everything through the brain. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every memory, every spiritual experience even, we experience through the brain. So we exist at different levels. We exist at this physical level of the body, at an emotional level of the heart, a mental level of the mind and intellect, and a spiritual level. And all of this comes through the brain. The brain integrates all of that into one whole experience of living. So it turns out that when you stimulate the brain from all 4 of these ways, they work synergistically and work better than just 1 or 2. So there's a chapter on the body. There's a chapter on the heart and emotional factors. There's a chapter on the mind and mental factors, chapter on spirit. Turns out there's a couple of meditation practices that have a very powerful effect on neurogenesis. But the biggest chapter in the book is devoted to diet. Now, if you want to build a beautiful high-end house, you can't use rotting wood or decaying lumber. You've got to use really high-quality building materials. And it's the same with the brain. To build a good brain, we need high-quality building materials. And so diet is incredibly important. So there's a number of foods that decrease our rate of neurogenesis that we want to avoid or minimize. And there's a number of foods that increase neurogenesis that we want to do more of. So it's a twofold strategy. We want to minimize those things that slow it down. We want to do more of those things that speed the rate of neurogenesis up.
So would you say then that nutrition perhaps is the most, if you had to choose one, the most important thing for brain health?
I'd say that and exercise.
Okay. So can we come back into, let's come back to exercise. Can you give us a few examples or many examples of what we should be avoiding and what we should be eating?
Yes. So the brain is composed of about 60% fat. And so one thing we want to be sure to do is eat a lot of good, high-quality fats. The ideal brain diet is going to be at least 50% fats, and it's going to be low to moderate carbohydrate and moderate protein. So one thing we want to avoid is sugar. A high sugar diet will cut your rate of neurogenesis in two. That's pretty astonishing when you think about how much sugar people consume. It cuts your rate of neurogenesis in half. So we want to avoid sugar, and also the high carbohydrate diet that has been sold to the West over the past 40, 50 years, it turns out it's also pretty much a disaster for the brain. Because a high carbohydrate diet, it all eventually gets converted to sugar, into glucose to fuel the brain. And over time, the brain and the cells of the body, when they try to take this glucose in through insulin, because the brain and the body are constantly flooded with carbohydrates and sugar, glucose, it creates insulin resistance. They become insensitive to this. And this is terrible for the brain for a number of reasons. For one, it increases inflammation. Another, it increases oxidation, free radicals. And for another, the increase in blood sugar and insulin is very damaging for every cell of the body, but particularly for neurons. So when you have insulin resistance, and it's estimated that probably about 80% of adults in the West anyway, and probably of the East at this point, have some degree of insulin resistance. And so high insulin levels, which comes from insulin resistance, means that your bloodstream is floating all of your cells in higher than optimal amounts of insulin, which is damaging to every cell, and higher than optimal amounts of glucose. And that also damages cells through a process called glycation. Glycation is the cross-linking of proteins. And so the cells become unusable. Like when you see the browning of a chicken on a rotisserie, that's actually through the process of glycation. The sugars in the chicken are cross-linking the proteins there, and that happens in the brain. If you look at cognitive decline, the rates of cognitive decline, and what people's blood sugar levels are, they track just about perfectly. So the higher your blood sugar, the faster your rate of cognitive decline. Mm-hmm. So a very important test for everybody to have is called a hemoglobin A1C. So when you go for your next yearly physical, your doctor will probably recommend you do this. Now, most physicians think that anything below 5.7, 5.8, or even 6.0 is normal. Well, it's not. It's pre-diabetic. Anything over 5.0, even 5.1, 5.2 would be like the bottom, means that you've got a good amount of insulin resistance, and so your brain is going to be shrinking and your cognitive capacity is going to be declining much faster than it needs to. So I'd say that the first and most important thing to do is to reverse your insulin resistance by decreasing carbohydrates, eating a lot more fiber, meaning non-starchy vegetables, and increasing your intake of healthy fats. So the brain is actually was evolved over thousands, millions of years to run very efficiently on fat, on ketone bodies. But in the modern world, very few people are what's called fat adapted or keto adapted. But if it's possible, if you want to, you can become fat adapted by lowering your carbohydrate intake. Now, some people, simply by lowering the amount of carbohydrates, they will reduce their insulin resistance, become insulin sensitive once again, and be fine. For other people, they need to reduce carbohydrates much more drastically. There's no one size that fits all here. Everybody's body is different. And so it just depends on what you can do.
Sorry, I was just going to interrupt there. So with that, as you said, everyone's a bit different. Would you recommend an approach whereby, say, Phil Maffetone recommends the 2-week, you take out all your carbs and then slowly introduce them to find out at what level suits you? For example, 50 grams might be plenty. Otherwise, maybe for someone else, it could be up to 100. But by taking them all away and then slowly introducing them, would that be a good way to know where, what's the right amount of carbs for you?
Yeah, I just say that many people require more than 2 weeks to become keto adapted. Some people require 3 or 4 weeks. And so you'd need to do glucose testing, which is simple to do. Glucose monitors are cheap and the strips are cheap. And so if you just test yourself, you can find out. But I think for most people, you want to give yourself probably a good 3 or 4 weeks, more than just 2 weeks, to become fully keto adapted. And then once you are fat adapted, then I think that's right. Introducing carbohydrates slowly to then see at what point it becomes too much. And I think really important in this is eating the right kinds of fats and fats that are prepared in the right way. So many people have been brought up with this idea that fat is bad. But it turns out that's really the main source of fuel for most of human history for the brain. So of the 60% of the brain that is fat, a third to a half of that is DHA. Now, DHA is one of the 3 omega-3 fatty acids. And it is probably the single most important nutrient for your brain. They did a series of experiments with monkeys where they brought up one group of monkeys on an omega-3 deficient diet and another group of monkeys on a high omega-3 diet. And then they looked at their brains. And what they found is that in the monkeys that had a low omega-3 diet, a diet that was deficient in omega-3, they had very simple, undifferentiated brains. But in the brains of the monkeys in the high omega-3 diet, they had very complex, richly differentiated brains and neural networks, almost like human beings. So most people need 3 to 5 grams of omega-3 every single day, which is fish oil. And you want a type of fish oil that is molecularly distilled, because fish tend to concentrate mercury, and mercury is one of the most potent neurotoxins known. I think it's second only to plutonium in how neurotoxic it is. So you want to get a brand of omega-3 that is molecularly distilled so that it has no contaminants, no mercury. And you also want one with a high DHA content. So in omega-3, it consists of EPA, DHA, and ALA. So ALA isn't terribly important. EPA is important because it has a lot of good anti-inflammatory properties to it. DHA is the most important. It's even more anti-inflammatory than EPA, and it's the fundamental building block of your brain. So just look for a good supplement that has all those things. And if you're vegetarian, some people try to do it with flax oil, and it turns out flax oil only is ALA, and ALA converts in the body to EPA very inefficiently, something only 5% of it. And then from there to DHA, almost none at all. And that's in healthy 18-year-olds, and it goes down from there. So flax oil is just about worthless in terms of the brain. In fact, they've looked at trying to elevate people's DHA levels through feeding them high amounts of flax oil and ALA for a period of time, and the blood levels haven't budged at all. If you're vegetarian, the only way you can get DHA would be through an algae form of omega-3.
Right.
So,
and would it also be then important to think about the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6?
Very good, yes. So historically, evolutionarily, there's been about from omega-3 to omega-6, there's been like a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2. Some people think as high as 1-to-4, but most people think 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. And omega-6, as you probably know, and many of your listeners probably know, is highly inflammatory. It's pro-inflammatory. And we need a certain amount of it because we want to be able to launch an inflammatory response in response to an infection or a cut or a cold or something. But we don't want too much of those inflammatory products in us, cytokines, because then it turns into chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is terrible for the brain and terrible for neurogenesis. It slows neurogenesis to a crawl. So that's right. We want to do a lot less omega-6s because the modern diet, it's a omega-3, omega-6 ratio of like 1-to-20 or 1-to-30, sometimes even 1-to-50, which is highly inflammatory. Really a disaster for the brain. So that means avoiding vegetable oils, except for olive oil and avocado oil, but avoiding soy oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, all of the other safflower oil, all of the other vegetable oils we want to avoid, and we never want to cook with them because those oxidize very rapidly. So the other thing we want to avoid in terms of fats is oxidized fats. When they thought that fat was bad for you back in the 1950s and 60s, what they didn't really discern or discriminate back then was the difference between oxidized fats and unoxidized fats. So oxidized fats mean it's rancid. And when you eat oxidized fats, what happens is that when those fats get into your bloodstream, they then oxidize cholesterol and other fats in your bloodstream, and that causes heart disease. That causes hardening of the arteries. That causes all sorts of problems. So we want to stop cooking with vegetable oil or anything at a really high temperature. Like what we want is good saturated fat and good mono unsaturated fat, a little bit of omega-6, no trans fats. And so that means we want to eat things like grass-fed meat, wild-caught fish, pastured chicken, pastured dairy, grass-fed dairy. We want things like nuts, avocados, eggs are one of the best things you can have for breakfast, as long as you don't cook them at too high a temperature. If you cook them at a high temperature, then you're going to oxidize the cholesterol, and that's going to be bad for you. So you want to cook them at a low temperature. Grass-fed cheeses, things like that.
Dr. Courtwright, that's interesting that you're talking about oxidation, and I think a lot of people don't realize that cooking with those oils, so giving olive oil as an example, is great on salads, but then when you cook the olive oil, it actually oxidizes, so it's actually not a good oil to cook with. Are there any oils such as avocado oil or anything else that you might recommend to cook with?
Yes. Ideally, we want to cook with saturated fats because those have a very high smoke point. You can cook at even high temperatures with them. So coconut oil, butter, ghee, lard, even avocado oil has a pretty high smoke point. But you're right, you don't want to cook with olive oil. And even the olive oil that's on the market, a lot of it is actually contaminated with other vegetable oils. In fact, probably most of it is, according to some recent surveys that have been done. So you want to be very careful about where your olive oil is sourced. And you only want to use it cold on salads, as you're saying.
Would it also be a good idea to buy it in a dark bottle so that it's not oxidated already?
Good point. Absolutely. Yes.
And on that note too, of just going back to fish oils, there are good fish oils and bad fish oils, as you said. So what should we actually look for in a fish oil? How do we know that it's a good brand, and what are we actually looking for in terms of ratios? And then also, once again, wouldn't the same theory apply in a dark bottle as opposed to a clear bottle?
Yes, that's right. And you want to keep it in a fairly cool temperature as well. So heat and light oxidize fats. And omega-3s and omega-6s are very vulnerable to oxidation. So that's right. You want to keep it in the dark and you want to keep it cool. So you want a ratio of about 50-50 EPA to DHA, or even higher. I know that Nordic Naturals makes one called DHA Extra, XTRA, that is like closer to like 1 to 3 EPA to DHA. That's a really nice one. There's others that are more 50-50. Those are fine too. But if possible, we want 1.5 grams to 2 grams of DHA every single day. And again, molecularly distilled.
And would that be for someone, say they're eating fish every day even, would you still recommend that they have a supplement?
I would. Well, certainly it would depend on the type of fish, because many fish don't have that much omega-3 in them. So it really depends on the type of fish. And again, if you're eating a lot of fish, you want to make sure that you're not eating large fish, because that's where mercury tends to concentrate. So people that eat a lot of fish need to be pretty careful about where it's sourced.
We talk about that too in an episode, so I totally agree with you there. So moving on then, so you've mentioned a lot of foods that we should have and a lot of fats, and then you've also mentioned foods and fats that we shouldn't have. Was there anything else under nutrition that you'd recommend that we do or don't do?
Yeah, we want to eat a lot of fiber, lots and lots of fiber. So most of your plate probably should be non-starchy vegetables. We want a lot of fiber because that feeds our microbiome. That feeds the 40 trillion or so bacteria in our gut, which is really important for maintaining good health and good brain health as well. So we want moderate protein. We want low carbohydrate or moderate carbohydrate if we can take it. But we want probably at least 50 to 80% fat in our diet, good fats. Now, there's a number of other nutrients that have a really quite powerful effect on neurogenesis. One of them is turmeric, which is the yellow in curry spice, and curcumin is the most active ingredient here. And that has a very, very powerful effect on neurogenesis. It's also a very powerful anti-inflammatory, which is great for the brain, a very powerful antioxidant, and it's neuroprotective. Now, the problem with just eating straight turmeric or curcumin is that it isn't absorbed very well. So if you do it, it's good to do it with something else. It's good to do it with phospholipids, say, for example, egg yolks, or to do it with a pepper extract called piperine, or you can do it micronized, where they take the curcumin powder and they make it very, very tiny. That increases the absorption about 8 times. So it's good to do that. Another thing is green tea. Green tea is fabulous for increasing your rate of neurogenesis. What you want is the equivalent of 10 to 15 cups a day of green tea, but you don't want that much caffeine. So you can get green tea extracts that are 98% EGCG that are caffeine free. And that's the sort of thing you want. It turns out that caffeine is another one of these problematic things. And I know most people drink caffeine. And so I always get kind of a groan when I say this, but people should know this, I think. Caffeine slows down neurogenesis, and it slows it down at every single level that they've tested it. So even the smallest biologically active amount of caffeine slows your rate of neurogenesis. So caffeine is a really double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, it can increase short-term memory, but on the other hand, it slows down your rate of neurogenesis, and it also is vasoconstricting, meaning it makes the blood vessels in your brain smaller. And you don't want that. You actually want more blood in your brain, not less. So the polyphenols in coffee and tea are really good for your brain, but the caffeine isn't. So if you can do a green tea extract or even a coffee extract, it's good for your brain. But particularly the EGCG in green tea is very powerful for increasing neurogenesis. Omega-3s, as I've said, increases neurogenesis by 40%. Now, when you increase, the book goes into about 30 different nutrients that increase neurogenesis. And let me just talk about one other one, because this is important. So when you increase your rate of neurogenesis, say you double it or triple it or quadruple it, you start feeling much, much better in your life in all sorts of ways. Now, the brain is very good at pruning new and unused neurons. And so about 50% of those new brain cells will get pruned very rapidly unless you do other things. And one of those other things is a nutrient called hesperidin. Now, hesperidin is a bioflavonoid from citrus fruits. And what it does is it keeps new neurons alive. So if you also do hesperidin, then you will get close to 100% survival rate of these new neurons. Now, hesperidin you can get as a supplement, but it also is very poorly absorbed unless you get it in the form of methylchalcone. So methylchalcone is the form that is most bioavailable, and it is 5 to 7 times more bioavailable than regular hesperidin.
Wow. And have you seen studies where people have actually started taking that and seen an increase or less pruning effect?
The studies so far have been done on monkeys and on mice and on dogs, not on humans. But there's no reason to think that this isn't going to apply because, these studies are very difficult to do. And so the human studies for some of these are lagging behind.
Sure. And by the time the studies actually come out and say it's all good, we'll all be probably too late to. So is there a particular supplement then, like a brand or anything like that you would recommend that we start taking?
Let's see. I think Doctor's Best makes one form of methylchalcone. I think whatever form of methylchalcone you can find is probably going to be fine.
Okay, great. Excellent. And look, I know that we can read the book and find out about 20, 30 other nutrients that you recommend. So we'll definitely do that. But before we run out of time, I'd love to talk to you about exercise and the role it plays in sharpening our brains.
Yes. So all forms of exercise, as you know, are good for health. Stretching, yoga, flexibility exercises, strength training, aerobic training, high-intensity interval training. But in terms of neurogenesis, there's only one form of exercise that has an effect, and that is aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise that is sustained for 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes. Now, aerobic exercise is anything that gets you breathing fast, gets your heart rate up and gets you breathing fast. So running and jogging, bicycling, swimming, fast dancing, fast walking, walking up a mountain, anything that gets you breathing hard for, again, 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes. That's like Miracle-Gro for your brain. Your brain just explodes in new brain cells. In fact, at this point, when neuroscientists want to increase neurogenesis in, say, mice or rats, the main thing they do is they just put a running wheel in the cage, and the neurogenesis just takes off. Now, again, about half of those new brain cells die off unless they do other things, such as methylchalcone. But aerobic exercise is the single most important thing you can do. So if you don't exercise, just start walking. And if you're walking, just walk a little faster. So you start to feel a little out of breath. So you're breathing a little bit heavier. And just work up gradually and do this more and more. And if you can do this 3 or 4 times a week, there's all sorts of studies that show there is cognitive enhancement from this. There is protection from depression, anxiety, stress, and your rate of neurogenesis shoots way up.
So, Doctor, would there be a particular heart rate zone to stay within?
That's a really good question. This research is so new on neurogenesis. It's just coming out right now that we are just at the tip of the iceberg. There's so much we don't know. And that's one of those things. It would be really interesting to find out what would be the optimal heart rate for the optimal amount of neurogenesis increase. Right now.
I'm just wondering, maybe if you do go into that anaerobic zone, then maybe you're not staying in the, what you're talking about, that longer sort of aerobic zone that you should be in. And then conversely, if you stay too low and you're not getting your heart rate up enough, then maybe your brain won't get those effects.
Right. That's right. If it doesn't go high enough, that's right. But if you're just starting out, you need to start slowly and then gradually work up. But you're right. You have to get a little bit out of breath for it to be in effect.
Interesting. And what about exercising the brain itself? So is it true that we need to be constantly learning new things, or can we just do things like crossword puzzles to keep our brains active and therefore healthy? Does the saying use it or lose it apply to mental stimulation?
Yeah, it really does. So it turns out that doing crossword puzzles or doing different computer brain games is pretty much useless in terms of neurogenesis and in terms of actually really enhancing brain function. Doing crossword puzzles makes you better at doing crossword puzzles. And doing brain game, video games, or computer games makes you better at those games, but it doesn't generalize across other systems of the brain. So the research on this is pretty compelling at this point, that what we need to do is do cross-training for the brain. We need to be learning new things constantly. We need to be exercising our brain. So it means being a lifelong learner. And it means using different parts of the brain. So reading, like even if it's reading on the internet, or writing, even if it's just writing email. Learning new things, taking a cooking class, taking a class at a college or a continuing education or a lifelong learning place, or doing a webinar. Actually, listening to this podcast right now is a type of learning that is increasing people's rate of neurogenesis and building in what's called cognitive reserve. So when you use your mind, when you learn new things, you build something called cognitive reserve, which is protective against Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's, as you probably know, is this epidemic that is about to become a tidal wave. Right now, 1 in 3 seniors at age 85 dies of Alzheimer's. And within a couple of years, 50% of the people who are 85 or older will have Alzheimer's. And since most of us are expected to live to be at least 85, that's pretty scary because right now there is no treatment for it.
Yeah, I heard a TED Talk in April given by Lisa Genova, and she actually said exactly the same thing about learning new things and that crossword puzzles weren't the thing to do. She also mentioned that she said, look around, the person next to you or the other person on your other side, one of you are going to have Alzheimer's disease by the time you sort of hit your 70s, 80s. And she also said, if you don't get Alzheimer's, you'll be the caregiver. So make your choice.
That's right. Now, the pharmaceutical companies have put in billions, tens of billions of dollars trying to develop Alzheimer's drugs. And so far, there have been hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials that have been complete failures. There is nothing, zero, zip. You go on the Alzheimer's Association website and they say there is no medication for this right now. However, from a holistic perspective, there is hope here. Now, there isn't much research done from a holistic perspective because there isn't much money to be made from it, right? Most research is driven by pharmaceutical companies who are looking to discover the next billion-dollar drug, or by academic researchers who are looking to patent the next billion-dollar drug. But there's a place actually here in California called the Buck Foundation, which is a nonprofit, that has come up with some interesting research from a holistic perspective, that it's actually a kind of simplified version of the plan in the book of diet, exercise. It's a body, heart, mind, spirit approach, a simplified version of it. And what they found is that they were able to reverse the cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's in 9 out of 10 people. And that the memory loss that had happened and the cognitive decline that had happened was reversed well enough for people to go back to work when they'd had to leave their work because of memory decline. Now, this is just a small clinical trial, but I think it points to the importance of a holistic lifestyle here and of the low sugar, higher fat diet that, together with meditation practice, learning new things, and an emotional climate to help neurogenesis and help the brain, we can actually reverse Alzheimer's when it's just starting, at least. We don't know about the later stages. There's so much damage then. There may not be much that can be done. Although even there's now some evidence to show that a ketogenic diet, meaning a very high fat diet, shows promise in reversing it for some people.
I think you've made it a pretty good argument for us all to go and do a neurohealthy living lifestyle from now on. And I think the first step would be then to buy your book. Are there any other sort of little tips or last minute sort of comments that you'd like to make in order to help us take that approach?
Well, I would just remind everybody what everybody really knows, which is that the brain is your own brain is the most important thing in the world. And taking care of your brain should be job one. If we want to live a long life and a healthy life, then job one, our highest priority, has to be to take really good care of our brain. Because what's the use of living a long time if we lose our minds, right? It's like, that seems like a good definition of hell to me. We want to stay sharp and clear to the very end. And it is possible if we really start taking good care of our brain now and start using more of our capacity. I think most people are probably at about 60, 70% capacity. When their rate of neurogenesis increases, it's like the rate of neurogenesis is the most important biomarker for brain health that most people have never heard of. But when that increases and you come up to 95, 100% capacity, life is a joy. It's like paddling downstream with the wind at your back on a sunny day. It's extraordinary. Bad things still happen, of course, but you have resilience. You can bounce back quickly. And that, I think, is just the best investment anybody can make.
Absolutely. On that note, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the show, Dr. CORTRIGHT. But before I let you go, can I ask you a bit of a personal question? Just
Sure.
wondering, do you have a tattoo?
Do I have a tattoo? No, I don't.
If you were to get one, what would you get?
Wow. Probably a heart.
And whereabouts?
I don't know. Maybe in my heart. I'm not sure.
I thought you might say a brain, but you've already got a good one of those by the sounds of it. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And we'll link to your website, your book, of course, in the show notes. And I'm sure people can get in touch with you directly on your website too if they've got any questions.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.